Welcome back to the Chief of Staff Show. Today we have Savannah Barker with us. So, Savannah, if you could just introduce yourself, sort of kick things off.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Savannah Barker. I'm based out of Los Angeles, and I am the People Chief of Staff at Calendly.
I'm so excited to have you because Calendly is such a large organization, and I've been speaking to chiefs of staff from small orgs, nonprofits, startups. It's really cool to me how the chief of staff role translates across all industries, all
hmm
stages, sizes. So I'm interested to hear from you what it's like being a chief of staff at such a large organization.
Yeah. So I am the Chief of Staff to our Head of People. And then I also support our CFO on sort of a ad hoc basis on some special projects. And previously at my last company, I was Chief of Staff to the CEO. Before that, I was Head of People. So this is a really cool sort of marrying of those experiences of being a Chief of Staff and then being a Head of People. And now I am a Chief of Staff to a Head of People, so I can I'm sort of uniquely poised to be able to kind of support her in running people at Calendly.
Yeah, that's really cool. What are some of the differences you noticed going from being a chief of staff to the CEO at a startup to such a large org? What are the biggest things that
Uh,
have stood out?
yeah, so being chief of staff to a CEO is definitely pretty different in terms of sort of where my focus was. I spent a lot more time on prep ahead of board meetings, for example. Our company-wide OKRs, company-wide strategy, and so now I'm taking some of that. Like I'm not involved in board meetings, but it's just sort of at a more focused scale for just the people team, right? So my focus is around sort of people, and to some extent the broader operations team, but sort of our operating cadence, our sort of OKR and goal setting framework, our strategy and focus areas, things of that nature that are just sort of supporting that team and that business unit as opposed to sort of enterprise wide, as I was doing at my previous company. But I do also get to support on some kind of broader things. Like, for example, I support our CFO on our monthly business review, our MBRs, with our broader leadership team. So that's one area where I kind of branch out a little bit outside of just people, and I get to support the broader company on something that I had some experience doing previously, and I'm passionate about. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm always telling people how the chief of staff role is such a gap filler. It's like wherever you're needed, wherever you have strengths, you can bring those unique strengths into the role and sort of mesh with what your leader needs. And that's another interesting thing, too, because often we're talking about chief of staff to the CEO,
Hmm.
but I always like to say, we call it the principal also, like your chief of staff to your principal, because it could be the head of people, it could be the CFO, the CHRO. There's a lot of areas where there's chiefs of staff that are supporting people other than the CEO.
Yes. Yes.
So one thing that's really I love about you, of course, we have a history, so I know where you've worked before and some incredible organizations here in Austin that I particularly love. I'm curious to hear about your career path and what led you to the chief of staff role. What sort of drew you to that? Is it something
Yeah.
you were pulled into or you sought out?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think, my background is sort of a combination of basically, people in HR, sort of broader operations, and then I would say like program management. And I think I'd always naturally leaned toward the people side of things just because I'm passionate about people. I'm passionate about the power of great people to unlock amazing things for an organization. I spent a lot of my career in startups, and I think when you're talking about smaller teams, the people are that much more impactful on the success of that company, right? Team is one of the big things that investors look at on your earlier stage. So really kind of was really passionate about people, and at my previous company, became their first sort of director of people. It was a smaller startup. Joined as director of people, had a team underneath me. Loved doing that work. A lot of it was taking things from 0 to 1, right? Like we didn't have a performance review process. And so we built that from scratch, things of that nature. But I think what I found after being in that role for a while is a lot of my time was spent managing my direct reports and enabling them to get work done, and me being able to do some of that work myself. And I actually kind of missed being an individual contributor. I missed being able to actually own a program or a project and really drive it from start to finish. And I also, developed a really great relationship with the co-founders at my previous company as the head of people, but I think more broadly as a confidant, supporting again with sort of operations, things like that. So I transitioned into a chief of staff to the CEO role there, and I think I just sort of found my home in terms of the sort of more broad impact I felt like I could have and just the type of problems I was solving. I've always been an executor. I've always been someone who likes to solve problems. I don't like talking about problems for too long. I'm like, all right, what are we going to do about it? So I think that was a good fit as a chief of staff when, you're supporting founder CEOs who are often, get really excited about cool ideas. And, I kind of joke like, chasing squirrels. And I think my job is to kind of be like, all right, great. Like which squirrel, which squirrel do you
Yeah.
want to do? We want to chase these squirrels. So I think I kind of found my sweet spot and I realized I really did love doing that more, high level IC work. And so then when the Calendly opportunity presented itself, where again, I'm now meshing two things that I both have experience in and love, people and being a chief of staff. I was like, yes, absolutely, I'm in. And so I get to support an amazing head of people over at Calendly, and get to kind of problem solve at that people level. But then having been a chief of staff to a CEO, I think I'm able to kind of keep in the back of my mind some of those big questions that I'm
Mhm.
sure our leadership are thinking about day in and day out. So yeah.
Yeah. I noticed how you said you miss the individual contributor role. And I think that's so important because a lot of people get confused about what a chief of staff is. Like, we're not just tactical, like maybe an executive assistant just doing the tactical day to day. And we're not just strategic, like a consultant. It's a
Yes.
really neat blend of like you're hands on, you're rolling your sleeves up and getting things done, but you're also doing that problem solving, making those strategic decisions, and being the sounding board.
Yeah.
So it's a great place for people like you who want to be individual contributors, but also want that higher level sort of strategic view.
Yeah. I discovered about myself that I love influencing and working with like peers. Like that was my sweet spot. I loved working with other leaders, and kind of bringing people together to try to figure out a problem together to problem solve cross functionally. And I loved kind of, I don't know, putting more energy into that, in order to problem solve, as opposed to, again, just being a people manager, which is in itself, a difficult job and requires a certain skill set. And of course, I loved my directs and I loved managing. I did enjoy managing people, but I think I found I was in my comfort zone when I was working with peers and influencing peers. Like that was where I felt the most like, all right, this is where I can really get things moving.
Yeah. And that influence piece is so vital for a chief of staff because it's not just, if you're the CEO, the boss, whatever, you can just tell people what to do. As a chief of staff, you really have to know how to influence people. So it's good when that's something that you enjoy. Otherwise, it is something you have to learn. Like, how do you understand people's motivations, their hesitations, their goals, and sort of align those with where the company is heading? So that influence piece is really a big one.
Yes, I think that's like the sort of my people hat, right? Comes from this idea of like, all right, it actually is very important to build consensus, right? Even if you have a decision, right, or what you need a decision to be, I think people want to feel heard, and when people feel like they're part of the solution, or that their input was relevant to kind of where we landed, they're more likely to invest more into that solution, right? So I think that's, I think that's part of that influencing piece, and just trying to kind of build consensus with people, where yes, it might take a little bit more energy than just being able to kind of say we're doing ABC, but you're probably going to be able to do ABC better if all of those
Yeah.
people are like really bought into what that is.
Yeah, 100%. That's a good way of looking at it too. Like you can get your way by just telling people, but if you bring them along and get their buy-in and they feel part of it, you're going to get a lot further.
Exactly.
So from your experience being a chief of staff twice at a smaller org, at a larger org, what do you feel like is the biggest misconception that you've come across about the chief of staff role?
Um, that's a great question. I think the most common one is that I'm not an executive assistant. And it does not say anything negatively of executive assistants. We have several at Calendly that I get to actually work with a lot who are incredible. But they are very different roles, right? An executive assistant, it is mostly tactical, managing the time in a very literal sense of their executive, making sure that, balls aren't being dropped. And I think with my job, it is a blend of, yes, there are certain tactical components of being a chief of staff, of course, but it does kind of add in that added layer of being a strategic, really like a partner to my executive, as opposed to just sort of um, taking direction from them, if that makes sense. And I think the other thing, this was true when I was at my smaller company, is the difference between a chief of staff and a COO, right? Which I think is another kind of, I think that difference probably is less and less relevant when maybe you're at a smaller company, but right, like a COO is overseeing operations. Like they presumably do have direct reports, right? They're overseeing whatever finance, legal, HR, et cetera. Whereas the chief of staff typically does not have any direct reports and is really sort of a principal IC supporting an executive. So I would say that's generally the misconception. I haven't actually had to deal with it too much at Calendly, which has been great. I don't think people think of me as being, an executive assistant to my leader, right? There's a sense of like, I am in rooms that she cannot be in. So I don't have to deal with that a lot. But I do think that's just a very common misconception of what a chief of staff actually does.
Yeah, I need to put together a big like 3-part Venn diagram of like, here's where we overlap, here's where we're
Yes.
not the same, like here's the differences. So I'll add that to my to-do list.
Yeah, that's a great. I think I've probably seen that at some point that really did have like executive assistant, chief of staff, COO. Because again, there are like genuine overlaps across those three, but they are distinct in a number of ways. And I think again for me, chief of staff, like that's the most fun. Like that's where I want to be. but yeah.
Yeah, and I was just speaking with someone about that the other day. Like chief of staff, it's such an incredible role. It can be a really good launch pad to other careers because you have so much visibility into what is going on like all across the organization. You can kind of feel out like what departments do you like the best. And you're working with the CEO, so you get like a very like top-down view of the whole organization. So it's a great launchpad career, but it's also a really great place to be like forever if you want. Is that ever anything you think about, like where you might want to go next, or you think to stick with?
I mean, I think one of the reasons I love being a chief of staff is because I don't want to be a CEO. Like I have no desire, and I think it's just I just think about I think as you get older and you gain more experience in your career, right? It's not just about it's about finding something that you both are good at and enjoy doing, and those are not always the same things, right? Like you might be good at something, but if you hate doing it, is that really how you want to be spending most of your time? And so I think, yes, I think as a chief of staff, being able to, again, previously report into a CEO, being able to have a heightened level of exposure to the business. Again, I'm in every board meeting, I'm in every executive meeting. I have just way more understanding of sort of the level of context that a CEO has when they're making decisions. But I sort of jokingly say, I'm like, I think CEOs need to be visionaries. They need to be great storytellers. They need to be able to paint a vision for the future that's exciting. I think that's why, sometimes there's a little bit of that like head in the clouds, right? But that it makes sense, right? Because they need to tell really compelling stories. And I think, I definitely am someone who believes in the power of storytelling, but I've never felt like I am personally like the best messenger of that kind of story, of that kind of vision. I'm not necessarily able to like access that same level of enthusiasm that I see a lot of great CEOs are able to access. And again, I just like being able to focus most of my energy on executing, on solving problems, on unblocking things. A CEO it has to think about those things. Plus, right, they also have a whole executive team under them that they're having to manage and having to work through. So I think for me, I don't know. I think I'm, right now, again, I sort of made a deliberate decision to go into another chief of staff role as opposed to going back into a director of people or HRBP type of role. Like that was a deliberate decision that I made because I knew I really enjoyed this work. I think in terms of the future, it's like, is there a world where I could end up back in people? Definitely. But I could also definitely see myself staying in this chief of staff role. And, growing in that because I just enjoy the actual work.
Yeah, that's what I'm finding more and more. People are like, it's not, it does sound cool to be like, this is a launchpad career to anything. I sometimes say like from chief of staff, you can go anywhere. And it is so true, but it's also like, it's also a really cool role. It pays really well. You have a great impact. You have a great influence on your organization and the direction that it's going. So yeah, sometimes I'm like, okay, do I want to be like a 4-time chief of staff?
Yeah. It is interesting to think about. It's like, would it start to look weird if someone was a chief of staff so many times? But I don't know. I think it's just a very specific and unique kind of role. So I don't know. And it is difficult. I think chief of staff, it feels like the type of role, right? It's like, you don't go to school to become a chief of staff, right? Like it's something where you really have to have, I think, certain kind of core characteristics, right? Again, I kind of put a lot of emphasis on like the ability to execute and the ability to influence. I think those are, to me, I think probably the two most important characteristics of a chief of staff. And you can learn those to a certain degree. I think you can get better at those, but I also just think some people are just more comfortable in that space. And there's also, I think, inherent to, any chief of staff and other chief of staffs I've spoken to at small companies, big companies, like it is a role that is inherently ambiguous. Like, right. I can't think of a more ambiguous, like it's just inherently an ambiguous role.
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. Like, it's such an ambiguous role. Any organization you work for, any individual principal that you're working for, it's going to be different. I'm sure even there's multiple chiefs of staff at the organization you're at right now. They all have different roles. It's not just one clear cut thing. And sometimes that can be, a little bit bothersome or frustrating because you don't have like really clear targets you need to hit, like so that you can say like, okay, I did this. It's not as quantifiable as some other roles. And so, yeah, it can be sort of frustrating. But when you have that mindset of like, hey, I just got to keep this engine going forward, like keep the train on its tracks and everyone's along, that's, your best hope for it.
Being able to like have an impact. I think that's, if I had to think about how do I measure like my success as how does my principal measure my success as a chief of staff? I think it really is impact, right? Am I solving the right problems? I think especially if you're in a startup environment, right? I mean, there's 25 new problems a day that you could spend time on if you wanted to. So a lot of your job, I think, not just as a chief of staff, to be honest, I think as kind of any leader in that kind of environment is to figure out, all right, what tackling the urgent and important, right? What are the right problems to solve for that are going to have the biggest impact on, on the business or on this business unit? And so that's the lens that I use a lot of time when I'm kind of trying to determine the best use of my time is even if something, even if there's a problem that's maybe persistent and maybe annoying or creating some sort of inefficiency, trying to always kind of take that step back and take that broader lens of like, all right, if I'm looking holistically, not only at the people function, but actually at the entire business, right? Where does this actually rank kind of in order of priority? You can't just kind of take the low hanging fruit because it means you can check something off your list. If at the end of the year, you can't really look back and say, here's how I meaningfully made an impact, for my executive, for my business unit, and for the business overall. That's how I would probably, rate my performance was I working on the right problems?
Yeah. And that proper prioritization piece is really critical too, because like you said, which squirrel are we chasing?
I know. Exactly. I'm like, can't chase all of them, right? But yes. And finding that balance of sort of flexibility, right? Especially in a startup environment, but also being able to establish some semblance of consistency because you can't just keep stopping and starting in a bunch of different directions, right? At a certain point, I think that's where that strategic piece comes in, right? Where you can kind of, if you get in the weeds too much, you can lose sight of like, wait, where are we actually going and what are we actually trying to do here? And yeah, I think, if you're at that level, you're again reporting into a CEO, so you more or less know everything that they know. I think it helps you to be able to prioritize within the weeds. What to be working on that's still going to get you to where you need to.
Yeah, and the other part of that too is like making sure that there's someone that you can hand things off to, like putting the systems and processes in place so that you can then like move on to the next problem and there's another team that's owning whatever issue or a
Yeah.
software that's covering it or
Yes.
Calendly taking care of it.
Yeah,
But
exactly. No, I one of my good friends, who actually worked with at my previous company, who is a chief of staff now. I think he's chief of staff to the CRO at another tech company. And we kind of joke that we feel like we kind of like come in and we're 0 to 1 people, right? So we come in, we're like, all right, there's this problem here. Who do we need to talk to? Who are the stakeholders? What do we need to know? All right, here's the fix. And then in terms of like maintaining the sort of ongoing, use of that, all right, cool. That's someone else. Like I came in, we built a solution together. We figured out who is going to sort of own this moving forward. And then we're on to the next thing. And I love that because it means the job never gets boring, right? Like there's always a new, right? It's like there's always a new challenge to tackle. And even within my role as the people chief of staff, right? I mean, there's always a new area that we could kind of be doing better. Even though we have, other leaders within our people function who are sort of overseeing their respective functions, right? There's a lot of times there will be cross-functional problems. That's like the biggest one, right? Where it's like, all right, we've got this big issue over here. It's going to require buy-in and work from legal and IT and finance. Like all these people are going to have to be a part of figuring out the solution, but who is actually driving, right? And so that's where, again, someone like me can go, hi, I will drive. I will help kind of get this up and running. And then sort of once ideally, if we've done a good job, sort of built that solution, then we can very easily sort of, hand that off to somebody else and let them run with it.
yeah. Yeah. In one of my previous organizations I was at where I didn't have the title of chief of staff, but I was definitely the chief of staff. But I
Yeah.
would say, just like you mentioned, CEOs are great storytellers. So what we would say, my boss would make something up and then I would make it real. And then I'd find someone else to make it recurring.
Right.
Like a really great framework for us. So it's like, okay, what do you want to do? Okay, I'll figure out how we're going to do it, but then someone else is going to keep doing
It's
it.
going to keep it going. I love that. That is exactly right. That's exactly CEO, chief of staff, and then the people who are going to actually run that and own that going on. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. So having been a chief of staff at a startup, at a large organization, what is like some advice that you would give to someone who's interested in becoming a chief of staff?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. I think one, which I would probably give this to anyone, regardless of if you want to be a chief of staff or not. But I just think that your professional reputation is extremely important. And how you build a professional reputation is, it's yes, building relationships is obviously kind of part of that, but I think it's also just follow through, right? Like you want to become known as the person who solves problems, right? I don't remember who said this, but there's some quote of like, if you want something to get done, give it to a busy person. And the idea is like, all right, like if you've proven that you're the type of person who can solve problems, people will continue to bring problems to you. And there's good and bad to that, right? Because sometimes it can be like, oh my gosh, overload, timeout, right? But I think a good thing is you can develop sort of, again, a sort of a professional or internal reputation for yourself as somebody who can solve problems and get shit done. And my dad uses this quote that I'm sure he stole from someone, but he just said like, you got to do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. It's so simple, it's so basic, and it's so rare. It's so rare. And if you can just do that, can just be true. If people can say that about you, that she does what she says she's going to do when she says she's going to do it, I think that's a very, very powerful way to build a reputation for yourself internally. And then I think the other thing is, figure out what your boss hates doing and fix that for them, right? Like I think that's a real thing, right? Like again, fixing problems. I think a lot of the job of a chief of staff is being able to effectively fix problems. And so if you can figure out like, all right, take things one level above maybe where you sit in terms of like, okay, what's the bigger kind of underlying issue that we're trying to unblock here that, I can tell is causing, headaches for everybody involved, for my boss, and kind of taking the initiative to be able to try to tackle that and try to drive towards a solution. I think that's another way that you can just get some more recognition for being the type of person who can solve problems. But yeah, I would say that those are my two. I know that's very vague, but I think that's my honest feeling is just like you develop a professional reputation for yourself, and then people start to notice, and they give you bigger and bigger and higher impact projects. So even speaking for myself within Calendly, right? I'm people chief of staff. So I'm supporting the people team. I'm solving problems. And then our CFO notices that I'm solving problems. So he says, hey, I have a problem. Could you solve this problem for me? And I do. And it's like, oh, okay, great. Can you solve it? Right. So it's like you start to kind of build a reputation of Savannah as the person that you go to if you need to solve a problem. And I think I think that's like key if you want to be a chief of staff, or just elevated as like a leader. Like a leader solves the types of problems that will sort of attract attention from people outside of just your immediate circle of folks you're working with.
Yeah, it's so important. I mean, trust and credibility is foundational for a chief of staff, and that is how you build trust and credibility, getting shit done. And just like your dad said, like, do the thing that you said you're going to do when you said you're going to do it. Like,
yes.
And that builds that trust, that credibility, so then you can have that influence and that impact.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that I've definitely like just learned, even just as being a chief of staff, or I've gotten better at, is having your principles back always externally, and then kind of using your private time to push back, right? Like, I think that's something that I had to kind of learn kind of the hard way, to be totally honest, by maybe not acting perfectly in certain situations, or maybe in a meeting with our whole executive team and folks are pushing back against the CEO, and I kind of see their point, right? But I think I at least believe, and maybe this is different for different people, but I think like sort of in public in front of others, like you need to have your person's back, and then when you're together, that's where you can then push back. You're not a yes man. Like you should push back if you disagree, if you think hey, no, I really think that this is the right decision. But I think there is a time and place where it's more appropriate to do that. And I think I learned as a chief of staff that I almost always prefer to do that in a setting where it is just me and the person I report into, and not in front of their peers or their directs or anything like that. So that's another kind of small piece of advice I would give that I definitely had to learn. Like I did not start that way.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that perspective. Of course, you don't want to be a yes person. You want to give them that like pushback, that like, challenge their ideas. That's important. You can't grow unless you're challenged, right? But having that sort of united front is so important, like just like they tell parents, like have a united front.
I was gonna say with my husband, right? I'm like, if we're in front of people, I will never kind of go against him in front of people. But if we get home and I go, you were totally wrong in that situation, by the way. So it's like, I do think that's real. Like it actually is important. And it doesn't mean you're phony. It doesn't mean you're like BSing, right? I think it's just a matter of just trying to, there's a time and place for everything. And there's a time when it's more important to kind of have your person's back, and a time when it is important to push back. And you also have to choose your battles, to be honest, because you're not going to win all of them. So that's another piece of it. You don't want to just become the person who's pushing back on everything.
Yeah, no, that's so important. I really, really appreciate your time today. Is there anything else before we go that you'd want to share with anyone? Maybe things you wish you knew before you became a chief of staff, or just any parting words of wisdom?
Oh man. I mean, it is an amazing job. Like I really do love it. I think throughout my career, I've done a lot of things that I have genuinely enjoyed, but for me, I have felt most at home being a chief of staff. It is a very difficult job. So it is not, if you're kind of the type of person who kind of wants to phone it in, or give it 50%, it's not the job for you. It is a very demanding job. But I think if you have, if you're reporting into a great executive, which I'm very lucky that I've now twice been able to report into really, really amazing people, it's an incredible job. Yeah, I love feeling like I can have an impact And I guess my parting words of wisdom, I think is, when we think about sort of moving up the corporate ladder, I think we always think about sort of management leadership roles, right? And I was part of that too, of just like, I love people, I'm going to become a head of people, right? It's a very sort of logical place where you go. And I think it took me a while to actually understand, like, actually, I really, really love being an individual contributor. I loved being a chief of staff. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's not a step back, right? Like, there's a lot of really talented, amazing, successful individual contributors. And there's more than one way to kind of find that kind of success. You don't have to be an executive. You don't have to be a C-suite level person, or I guess the chief of staff is C-suite, but you don't have to be overseeing like a department, right, in order to kind of reach the top of that corporate ladder. Like there's a lot of, frankly, like, fun in doing individual contributor work that I kind of learned to love and learned to appreciate when I got further and further and further away from it as a leader.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate your words of wisdom, your story, and super appreciate you.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Thank you.